The book of Genesis is the first book of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament. Its name in Hebrew is the same as its first word, Bereshit, in the beginning. Genesis purports to be an account of the creation of the world, the early history of humanity, and the origin of the Jewish people. Genesis is part of the Torah or Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Tradition holds that Moses was the author of the Torah. It was probably composed around the 5th century before Christ, although there are arguments for as early as 270 before Christ. Based on scientific interpretation of archaeological, genetic, and linguistic evidence, some mainstream biblical scholars consider Genesis to be primarily mythological rather than historical. But these are erroneous claims. It is divided into 2 parts, the original history, chapters 1 to 11, and the ancestral history, chapters 12 to 50. The original history sets forth the author's concepts of the nature of the deity and of humanity's relationship with its creator. God creates a world that is good and suitable for humans, but when man corrupts it with sin, God decides to destroy his creation, sparing only the righteous Noah and his family, in order to restore the relationship between man and God. The ancestral history, chapters 12 to 50, tells the prehistory of Israel, God's chosen people. At God's command, Noah's descendant, Abraham, travels from his birthplace, described as Ur of the Chaldeans, and whose identification with the Sumerian Ur is tentative in modern scholarship, to the God-given land of Canaan, where he lives as a sojourner, giving him his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and through the mediation of his son Joseph, the children of Israel descend into Egypt, 70 in all, with their households, and God promises them a future of greatness. Genesis ends with Israel in Egypt, ready for the arrival of Moses and the Exodus, departure. The narrative is interrupted by a series of covenants with God, successively narrowing the scope from all humanity, the covenant with Noah, to a special relationship with just one people, Abraham and his descendants through Isaac and Jacob. In Judaism, the theological significance of Genesis focuses on the covenants linking God with his chosen people and the people with the promised land. Genesis was written anonymously, but both Jewish and Christian religious traditions attribute the entire Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, to Moses. During the Enlightenment, philosophers Benedict Spinoza and Thomas Hobbes questioned Moses' authorship. In the 17th century, Richard Simon suggested that the Pentateuch was written by multiple authors over a long period of time. Multiple authorship is suggested by internal contradictions in the text. For example, Genesis includes 2 creation accounts. By the late 19th century, most scholars had accepted the documentary hypothesis. This theory held that the 5 books of the Pentateuch came from 4 sources: Yahwist, abbreviated J, Elohist, E, Deuteronomist, D, and the priestly, P, source. Each source was believed to tell the same basic story, with the sources later combined by different editors. Scholars have been able to distinguish between sources based on the designations for God. For example, the Yahwist source uses Yahweh, while the Elohist and priestly sources use Elohim. Scholars also use repeated and duplicated stories to identify separate sources. In Genesis, these include the 2 creation stories, 3 different sister-woman stories, and the 2 versions of Abraham sending Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness. According to the documentary hypothesis, J, was produced in the 9th century before Christ in the southern kingdom of Judah and is considered to be the earliest source. E was written in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century before Christ. D was written in Judah in the 7th century before Christ and is associated with the religious reforms of King Josiah around 625 before Christ. The latest source is P, which was written in the 5th century before Christ in Babylon. Based on these dates, Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch reached their final present form only after the Babylonian exile. Julius Wellhausen argues that the Pentateuch was finalized during the time of Ezra. Ezra 7 verse 14 records that Ezra traveled from Babylon to Jerusalem in 458 before Christ with the law of God in his hand. Wellhausen argues that this is the newly compiled Pentateuch. Nehemiah 8-10, according to Wellhausen, describes the publication and public acceptance of this new law code in 444 before Christ. There was now a large gap between the earliest sources of the Pentateuch and the period they claim to describe, which ended around 1200 before Christ. Most scholars adhered to the documentary hypothesis until 1980. Since then, a number of variations and revisions of the documentary hypothesis have been proposed. The new supplementary hypothesis posits three main sources for the Pentateuch: J, D, and P. The E source is considered to be no more than a variation of J, and P is considered to be a corpus of revisions and expansions of J, or non-priestly, material. The Deuteronomic source does not appear in Genesis. More recent thinking is that J dates either just before or during the Babylonian exile, and the final addition by the priests was made late in the exile period or soon after. Russell Gmirkin argues that Genesis was composed in the late 270 before Christ, drawing on Greek sources such as Berossus Babyloniaca and reflecting the political context of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms. As for the reasons for the book's creation, one theory that has attracted considerable interest, although still controversial, is that of the Persian imperial permit. This suggests that the Persians of the Achaemenid Empire, after the conquest of Babylon in 539 before Christ, agreed to grant Jerusalem a great deal of local autonomy within the empire, but required the local authorities to create a single code of law that was accepted by the entire community. The two powerful groups that made up the community, the priestly families who controlled the Second Temple and who traced their lineage back to Moses and the wilderness wanderings, and the large land-owning families who made up the elders, and who traced their own lineage back to Abraham, who had given them the land, were in conflict on many issues, and each had its own origin story. However, the Persian promise of a significant increase in local autonomy for all provided a powerful incentive to collaborate in the creation of a single text. Genesis is an example of a work in the genre of antiquities, as the Romans knew it, a popular genre that recounted the outward appearance of people and their ancestors and heroes, with elaborate genealogies and chronologies interspersed with stories and anecdotes. Notable examples are found in the work of Greek historians of the 6th century before Christ. Their intention was to connect notable families of their own time with a distant and heroic past, and in this way they made no distinction between myth, legend, and fact. Professor Jean-Louis Scar of the Pontifical Biblical Institute calls the antiquarian historian's basic rule the law of preservation: everything old is valuable, nothing is removed. This antiquity was necessary to prove the value of Israel's traditions to the nations, the Jews' neighbors in the early Persian province of Judea, and to reconcile and unite the different factions within Israel itself. Describing the work of the biblical writers, John Van Setters writes that because of the lack of much historical tradition and none from the distant past, they had to use myths and legends of earlier periods. To make sense of the variety of different and often contradictory versions of stories and to connect the stories with each other, they fit them into a genealogical chronology. Tremper Longman describes Genesis as a theological history. The fact that these events happened is assumed, not argued. The purpose of the text is not to prove the history, but rather to impress the reader with the theological significance of these actions. The truth is that all Scripture is inspired of God and profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. 2 Timothy 3 verses 16 to 17. The original manuscripts are lost, and the text of surviving copies varies. There are 4 main groups of surviving manuscripts: the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, in Samaritan script, the Septuagint, a Greek translation, and fragments of Genesis found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest, but they cover only a small portion of the book. Genesis appears to be structured around the recurring phrase La Toldart, meaning these are the generations, with the first use of the phrase referring to the generations of heaven and earth, and the remainder marking individuals. The formula Toldart, which occurs 11 times in Genesis, serves as a heading that marks a transition to a new topic. However, what this meant to the original authors is unclear, and most modern commentators divide it into 2 parts based on subject matter: the primordial history, chapters 1 to 11, and the patriarchal history, chapters 12 to 50. Although the former is much shorter than the latter, it sets out the main themes and provides an interpretive key to understanding the entire book. The primordial history has a symmetrical structure dependent on the flood story, chapters 6 to 9, with the events before the flood mirroring those after it. The patriarchal history is structured around the 3 patriarchs Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph. The stories of Isaac probably do not constitute a coherent cycle of stories and function as a bridge between the cycles of Abraham and Jacob. In 1978, David Clines published The Theme of the Pentateuch. Considered influential as one of the first authors to address the question of the overarching theme of the Pentateuch, Clines concluded that the overall theme was the partial fulfillment, which implies also the partial non-fulfillment of the promise to or blessing of the patriarchs. By calling the fulfillment partial, Clines draws attention to the fact that at the end of Deuteronomy the people of Israel were still outside Canaan. The patriarchs or ancestors are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with their wives. Joseph is usually excluded. Since the name Yahweh was not revealed to them, they worshipped Elohim in its various manifestations. It is worth noting, however, that in the Jawistic source the patriarchs refer to God by the name Yahweh, for example in Genesis 15. Through the patriarchs God announces the election of Israel, that is, He chooses Israel to be His special people and commits Himself to their future. God tells the patriarchs that He will be faithful to their descendants, meaning Israel, and Israel is expected to have faith in God and His promise. Faith in the context of Genesis and the Hebrew Bible means consent to a binding relationship, not a totality of faith. The promise itself has 3 parts: offspring, blessings, and land. The fulfillment of the promise to each patriarch depends on the presence of a male heir, and the story is constantly complicated by the fact that each would-be mother, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, is barren. However, the patriarchs maintain their faith in God, and God in each case gives a son, in Jacob's case, 12 sons, the foundation of the chosen Israelites. Each succeeding generation of the three promises achieves a richer fulfillment, until through Joseph the whole world achieves salvation from famine, and by leading the children of Israel into Egypt, he becomes the means by which the promise can be fulfilled. Scholars generally agree that the theme of divine promise unifies the patriarchal cycles, but many would question the efficacy of attempting to explore the theology of Genesis by pursuing a single overarching theme, citing instead as more productive the analysis of the Abrahamic cycle, the Jacobic cycle, and the Josephic cycle, and Yahwist and priestly sources. The problem lies in finding a way to unify the patriarchal theme of divine promise in the stories of Genesis 1 to 11, the origin story, with their theme of God's forgiveness in the face of man's evil nature. One solution is to see the patriarchal stories as the result of God's decision not to remain alienated from humanity. God creates the world and people rebel, and God chooses, elects, Abraham. To this basic plot, which comes from the Yahwist, the priestly source has added a series of covenants, dividing the story into stages, each with its own distinctive sign. The first covenant is between God and all living beings and is marked by the sign of the rainbow. The second is with the descendants of Abraham, Ishmaelites and others, as well as Israelites, and its sign is circumcision. And the last, which does not appear until the book of Exodus, is with Israel alone, and its sign is the Sabbath. A great leader mediates each covenant, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and at each stage God gradually reveals himself by name, Elohim with Noah, El Shaddai with Abraham, Yahweh with Moses. By summing up the time periods in the genealogies of Genesis, religious authorities calculated what they believed to be the age of the world since creation. This system of counting years, Anno Mundi, is the basis of the Jewish calendar and the Byzantine calendar. Calculations vary somewhat, but generally place the age of the earth at about 6,000 years. During the Protestant Reformation, rivalry between Catholic and Protestant Christians led to closer study of the Bible and a competition to take its words more seriously. Thus, scholars in Europe from the 16th to the 19th centuries treated the book of Genesis as factual. As evidence was discovered in the fields of paleontology, geology, and other sciences, scholars attempted to fit these discoveries into the Genesis creation account. For example, Johann Jacob Schuxer in the 18th century believed that fossils were the remains of creatures killed during the flood. This literal understanding of Genesis fell out of favor with scientists during the Victorian crisis of faith, as evidence accumulated that the earth was much older than 6,000 years. There are many scriptures written by people, kings, and emperors who rot. There are also many scriptures written by writers, historians, and scholars who pass away. But there is only one scripture. The Holy Scripture of God. It will last in eternity. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the Moses Film channel and give a thumbs up under the video in support. God bless you.